Hi guys, it's Shane again, and today I wanted to talk about a topic that sort of got brought to my attention while I was YouTube scrolling, and it's a term and a couple of terms that are used far too often in modern Formula One, and it's about whether or not some drivers are over or underrated, and why using those terms can, when with a little bit of context applied and perception applied, can be utterly ridiculous. So the inspiration for this video is I was scrolling through YouTube the other day, as you do, looking for something funny or God forbid something that might actually educate me on YouTube to watch, and I came across a poll by RaceFeed, which I regularly do come across. They are normally great, but it was, is George Russell overrated or underrated? And it got me thinking, and I did have a conversation in the comments about this, and that question isn't black or white. There's no yes or no. Because if you apply a little bit of context and outside perception and an overall view, you could very easily say that certain drivers are underrated that probably aren't, but you could argue that case. And that's the point I'd like to make in this video. So the thing is, we watch a sport and we love a sport that is predominantly machine based. No one's going to deny that. It's about the technology you have at your disposal. And that can make it very hard to properly judge it, but it can also make it incredibly easy to underrate or massively overrate drivers based on perception. And a good example of this is an example of Lewis Hamilton versus Max Verstappen. Now, I will get back to it where I feel on these two later, but when you take into account everything, the driver in the best car, due to public perception, you could argue is underrated. So I would argue that you could consider Hamilton underrated because all of his success and all of his domination is very rarely any credit given to him. Most people would just disregard it and say, oh, it's just because he's got the best car. Yes, he has the best car, but he is also a phenomenal talent. And just disregarding his talent because he's in the best car, in a way, underrates him. Like, he's put himself in that position. He's a fantastic driver, and you have to still be brilliant to dominate the way that Lewis does. And yes, Mercedes, their team, their strategists, their technology has a huge impact on how much Lewis has dominated, but so does he. And to deny that does underrate Lewis as a driver. And in the same breath, you have drivers like Max and Checo, who I think you could argue, less so with Max, but I think in a way, when people were saying, especially last year, and this slightly bugged me, it was like, oh, is Perez the most underrated driver on the grid? No, he's not, right? This is just a fact. If you're going if you're going for the definition of underrated, where a driver doesn't get the credit or recognition they deserve for how they are performing, then there is no way you can classify Sergio Perez as underrated. He gets every bit of credit he deserves for the performances he puts in. No one has ever said, oh, he's not actually that good, right? We've all always said Sergio Perez is a very good driver. He is not underrated. That is the wrong use of the term underrated. An underrated driver is someone who does a good job or does a very good job regularly and never gets any real credit for what he's doing. A driver such as Valtteri Bottas, I would say, is underrated because if it goes wrong, everyone jumps on Bottas. It's immediately his fault. But when he has those brilliant weekends, when he's just better than Hamilton, it's just the car. Like, Bottas never gets any credit for how good he is capable of being. That is an underrated driver. A driver who performs brilliantly and everyone's just like, nah, it's not him, it's just the car. Right? And on the same breath, if the Red Bull are a little bit behind and Max isn't there, it's like, oh, it's fine, it's the car, it's not Max, because we refuse to blame Max for that. That could be an overrated driver. I'm not saying Max is overrated. I love Max Verstappen. Verstappen is fantastic. But because he never gets any of the stick for things going wrong, you could argue he's slightly more overrated than a driver like Lewis Hamilton. Overall, I think, with the question that brought us up, is George Russell overrated or underrated? Neither. He's very properly rated for what he is. From what we've seen of George Russell, he is better than both Robert Kubica and Nicholas Latifi in the same car, and he won the Formula 2 World Championship in a contest against Lando Norris. He is a good driver, very clearly, but is he overrated? Do we all think he's significantly better than he is? No, I don't think people are hyping him up that much, and if you are, then it's a bit early to say that. And I don't think anyone's disregarding his talent. He's neither overrated nor underrated. And a lot of drivers fall into that category. As I said, the truly underrated drivers are the drivers who don't get any credit for doing fantastic jobs, doing truly brilliant jobs, or don't get enough credit for the job they are doing. Again, bringing it back to the drivers, like the two Mercedes drivers, I would say that they are underrated by the definition of underrated, where they don't get enough credit for the job they do. It's the way that Bottas gets slaughtered every season because he has a few off races. Every driver has a few off races, but because he's in the best car, it's immediately his fault. Like, that's a little bit ridiculous. In the same way that Leclerc doesn't take quite so much flack because he's not in the best car. Like, Seb took a lot of flack for making a few errors. Every driver makes errors, right? And to just slate them immediately because they're in the public eye, and they're not the darling of Formula One. That is a little bit double standards in Formula One. We're going to see a lot more with Max this year now that Red Bull do seem to have the car to challenge Mercedes on a more regular basis. We're going to see if he's a champion because he needs to be. He's going to need to be a champion to beat Lewis Hamilton. Don't let anyone fool you there. Like, just because he's got even equipment doesn't mean Max is immediately going to beat Lewis because he's suddenly, like, Lewis isn't there. The fact that he's still, with the exception of Monaco where Mercedes were nowhere and Hamilton was nowhere, he's still not doing great in the fight. He's still losing the fight to Lewis. Says a lot about how much talent Lewis has and how much talent Max has. And the fact that Max is continuing to beat his teammates says a lot about Max. But to say that any driver is overrated or underrated is really hard in Formula One unless you apply a lot of context to it and include public perception. So when you include the public perception, yes, I would argue that some people massively underrate Lewis Hamilton. A lot of people massively underrate Valtteri Bottas, and a lot of people hugely overrate Max Verstappen because of the public's perception and the fact that because Mercedes is the best car, those drivers just should be winning, but not taking into account how they are winning, how Mercedes and how Hamilton and Bottas are doing their job and doing a very good job of it. Like, for all of the fans that are out there saying, oh, Bottas isn't good enough for Mercedes, clearly Toto Wolff thinks so, and he's actually paid to make those decisions. So that should say something. To sort of sum it up, like, it's hard to sum up a point of this. This is a real discussion. And just because my opinion is this, it doesn't mean your opinion is wrong. I just think it's like the opinion of whether Monaco should or shouldn't be on the calendar. That's entirely opinion based. I personally don't think it should. I don't, because the racing's always been a bit of a joke there, and that's an entire another conversation though. But with the point in hand, it's really hard to put, like, when you look at drivers, if I go back through time and look at drivers who were truly underrated for what they were, for what they achieved and didn't get enough credit for it, I would think of drivers such as Martin Brundle, who was a very good mid-grid driver and then got thrown out of Benetton despite even Briatore admitting that he was one of Michael Schumacher's strongest teammates. He was underrated because they didn't realise exactly how good Michael Schumacher was. So Brundle spent the rest of his career being sort of thrown under the rug a little bit. And then on the other end of the spectrum, a driver I think was hugely overrated through his career was Juan Pablo Montoya, who had that ruthless speed, which everybody loved, but he wasn't a proper Formula One driver in a way. He didn't have the fitness and commitment that would have made him a true F1 driver. That's why his results didn't support all of the hype. He didn't get the results that everyone said he deserved because he didn't deserve them because he wasn't as committed as someone like Kimi Raikkonen, who was his teammate at the time. Kimi was just the more complete driver. But with modern F1, a driver like Latifi, who everyone just disregards, right? He's, like, last weekend, he was not far off George Russell, right? Does that mean Latifi's underrated? I'd argue so. If he's keeping close to Russell, then yeah, I'd argue that's relatively underrated. Again, I'll come back to it. I'd say Valtteri Bottas is massively underrated by almost the entire F1 community, which have conveniently forgotten his incredible performances for Williams prior to him joining Mercedes, where he has been consistently pretty close to Lewis Hamilton. And when we're all saying it's like, oh, Red Bull just need a teammate that's just a few tenths off of Max Verstappen, Mercedes have that in Valtteri Bottas. They have that perfect number two, but everyone just writes him off as shit. So is that going to be the case when Red Bull finally get that driver that's just 2 or 3 tenths off of Max? That, oh no, he's too far off, he's not there. Is that how it goes? Because you can't, like, you're having your cake and eating it at that point. It's ridiculous. So, like, I would probably say, I won't say Valtteri is the most underrated driver on the grid. I think that could possibly go to Esteban Ocon right now, who everybody is saying is going to lose his drive at Alpine, and everyone was at the start of the season. Yeah, no, he isn't. He's been incredible this season. I know Alonso's still adapting, but Ocon has made him look a mug so far. He has been the quicker of the two drivers, without a doubt. And at the moment, the Alpine bosses are like, yeah, he's the only guy we're considering. So no, Gasly is not going to be in that seat next season. So he's very underrated. And I think Albon was quite underrated because he was teammates to Max. That's not an easy job. It's the same reason I think Bottas is underrated. It's all perception, it's all where you stand. It's easy to say, oh, this driver's really overrated. Like people who think Hamilton's overrated because he had good technology, you are inherently underrating the talent of the man. Like, if you say Hamilton's overrated because of his machinery, you are feeding my argument of why he's underrated because you are detracting from his own ability. That's the whole point of how these arguments work in circles. So, if you have ideas on what you think makes a driver over and underrated, please let me know. I'd love to have a conversation because I love learning about why people think certain drivers are really good, why people think certain drivers are hugely underrated. And I suppose a better term in some cases is disrespected. I think it's incredibly disrespectful to Hamilton's talent to write him off. Maybe not underrated, but definitely disrespected. So let me know the drivers you think are underrated and overrated, and let me know why. And we will have a conversation about it, and hopefully we'll all learn something, because this is an area of Formula One that I do find fascinating, because it is all in the heads of the fans. This is always a different conversation with different people, and you can always learn that way, and that's what I enjoy watching Formula One for, and I enjoy engaging with other Formula One fans, because I can learn that way, and it makes me a more rounded F1 fan. It makes me a more rounded person, understanding different perspectives, so it is truly fascinating to me. Until next time, I have been Shane Nye, and thank you for watching.